Chapter 1. The Healer's Ghost. The iron-scented tang of dried blood always clung to the stones of the infirmary, a perfume Amara had learned to wear like a second skin. She pressed a cool, damp cloth against the forehead of a young warrior, his skin burning with a fever that smelled of silver-tipped claws and infection. Outside the heavy oak doors, the victory drums of the Moonfall Pack thundered, shaking the very vials of wolfsbane and lavender lining her shelves. Every rhythmic beat felt like a physical blow to her chest because it signaled the return of the men, who saw her as little more than a piece of the architecture. She moved with a practiced, silent grace, her fingers steady as she stitched a jagged tear in a soldier's shoulder. Being an Omega meant living in the peripheral vision of the world, a ghost that tended to the living. The doors creaked open, admitting a gust of mountain air and the suffocating, spicy scent of cedar and lightning. Amara didn't need to look up to know that Alpha King Cassian had entered the room. His presence was a gravitational pull, a heavy weight that made the oxygen in the room feel expensive. He stood by the hearth, his leather armor dusted with the grime of the battlefield, yet he looked every bit the god his people worshipped. He began discussing the casualty counts with his beta, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Amara's feet. Why did her heart still betray her by skipping a beat at the sound of a man who barely knew her name? She focused on the warrior's wound, pulling the thread tight, refusing to let her gaze wander toward the golden-haired king. "Amara, the poultices are ready for the northern patrol," a senior healer called out, breaking the spell of the Alpha's presence. She nodded, gathering the bundles of herbs while keeping her head bowed, a posture of submission that felt like a cage. As she crossed the room, she passed within inches of Cassian. The heat radiating from his body was a physical force, a summer sun in the middle of a winter night. For a fleeting second, his conversation faltered. He turned his head, his piercing amber eyes landing on her for a heartbeat. "The warriors speak highly of your steady hands, Omega," Cassian remarked, his tone casual yet carrying the weight of a royal decree. Amara stopped, her breath hitching in her throat as she offered a shallow, respectful dip of her head. "I only do what the goddess intended, Alpha King." "Modesty is a rare trait in this hall," he replied, a small, inscrutable smirk playing on his lips before he turned back to his maps. She hurried away, her pulse racing like a trapped bird against her ribs. That tiny spark of acknowledgement felt like a flame in a dark cavern, fueling a hope she knew was dangerous. Was it possible he saw more than just a servant when he looked at her? She spent the next hour in a daze, her mind replaying those 5 seconds over and over until the words lost their meaning. In the world of werewolves, rank was everything, and the distance between an Omega healer and an Alpha King was an unbridgeable chasm. Still, as she watched him command the room with effortless authority, she wondered if a heart could ever be loud enough to drown out the laws of the pack. The celebrations moved to the Great Hall, leaving the infirmary in a heavy, ringing silence. Amara cleaned her instruments, the clink of metal on metal sounding lonely in the dim light. She found herself wondering if he was drinking ale, if he was laughing, or if he was already planning the next conquest. The mystery of his inner thoughts was a puzzle she had no right to solve, yet her soul ached to try. Why does the moon pull the tide? Because some things are simply designed to yearn for what they can never touch. She realized then that her secret admiration wasn't a crush. It was a slow-growing tether that threatened to pull her under. As the candles flickered low, a strange restlessness took hold of her spirit. She felt a sudden urge to deliver the final batch of strengthening tonics to the Alpha's personal quarters, a task usually reserved for the morning. It was an excuse, a flimsy veil for her desire to be near his essence one last time before sleep claimed her. She climbed the winding stone stairs, the cold air biting at her ankles, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She reached the heavy tapestries that screened the entrance to the Alpha's inner sanctum, her hand hovering over the fabric. Then, she heard the laughter, sharp, boisterous, and cruel. "Think of the optics, Cassian," a voice boomed, likely his lead commander. "The pack needs a Luna who can lead a charge, not one who just sews up the mess afterward." Amara froze, her fingers curling into the velvet of the curtain. "We were joking about the little healer earlier," another warrior added, his voice thick with drink. "She's got a pretty face for an Omega. Maybe she'd make a decent mate for a scout?" She held her breath, her entire existence narrowing down to the silence that followed. She waited for Cassian to defend the woman who had spent the last 3 nights tending to his dying men. Surely the man who had looked at her with such intensity earlier would not let them speak of her like she was cattle. The silence stretched, agonizingly long, until finally the Alpha King's voice cut through the air, cold and dismissive. "Amara?" Cassian let out a short, dry chuckle that felt like a blade to her throat. "She's sweet, I suppose. A capable girl with a needle. But she's not queen material. A Luna must be a wolf of fire and steel, not a mouse hiding in the infirmary." The room erupted in fresh laughter, the sound echoing in the hallway like the breaking of glass. Amara felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and hollowed out. The tiny flame of hope she had nurtured was extinguished in a single, brutal breath. She didn't stay to hear the rest. She turned and fled down the stairs, her vision blurring as the walls of the castle she called home began to feel like the bars of a prison. Every step back to her small, shared room was a lesson in reality. She had been a fool to think a few kind words meant a shifting of the stars. In his eyes, she was a tool, a functional part of the pack's survival, but never a woman worthy of his throne or his heart. The realization was a bitter poison, settling deep in her marrow. She reached her bedside and pulled out a tattered rucksack, her movements frantic and fueled by a sudden, sharp clarity. If she was nothing more than a mouse to them, then she would no longer provide the comfort they took for granted. She packed only the essentials, a few dried herbs, a sturdy cloak, and a small dagger she used for cutting roots. The Moonfall Pack was her birthright, but it had become her tomb. She looked at the moon through the small window, its pale light reflecting the coldness in her own soul. Why should she stay in a place where her value was measured only by her utility? She would leave before the sun could witness her shame. As she slipped out of the side gate and into the dark embrace of the forest, she didn't look back. She didn't see the way the shadows danced behind her, or hear the sudden, pained howl of a wolf that had just realized its world was about to change. The forest was a labyrinth of silver and black, but for once the wild didn't frighten her. The fear of being invisible was far greater than the fear of the unknown. She crossed the boundary line of the pack territory, the magical veil shimmering as she passed through. She was a rogue now, a wolf without a home, but for the first time in her life, she was a woman with a choice.
Chapter 2. The Severed String. Cassian bolted upright in his bed, a cold sweat drenching his skin and his heart thundering against his ribs like a trapped beast. A searing, white-hot pain tore through his chest, a sensation so violent he feared his lungs had been punctured by an invisible spear. He gasped for air, clutching the silken sheets, his amber eyes scanning the dark room for an attacker that wasn't there. His wolf, usually a disciplined and silent companion, was pacing frantically within his mind, snarling at a void that had suddenly opened in the center of their shared soul. Something was wrong, fundamentally and catastrophically wrong, yet he couldn't put a finger on the source of the agony. "Cassian?" "You roared loud enough to wake the ancestors," his beta Silas said as he pushed through the door, his hand already on his sword hilt. The Alpha King struggled to find his voice, the pain in his chest slowly dulling into a hollow, aching throb. I don't know. A nightmare, perhaps. But it felt like my very spirit was being dragged across broken glass." He stood up, his legs feeling strangely weak as he paced the floor. He tried to reach for the usual connections he felt with his pack, the subtle threads of emotion and loyalty that linked a king to his people. Most of them were intact, the courage of the warriors, the sleepiness of the elders. But one thread was missing. It was a thread he hadn't even realized was there, a thin, shimmering cord of pure light that had been anchored to his heart since his first shift. Now there was only a frayed, raw end where the connection had been severed. "Report," Cassian barked, the authority in his voice returning as he masked his vulnerability. Silas frowned, sensing the tension. The perimeter is secure, no intruders. The warriors are resting. However, there is one anomaly. The Omega healer Amara did not show up for the morning rounds. Her room is empty. The name hit Cassian like a physical blow. Amara, the quiet girl with the soft eyes and the scent of crushed wildflowers. He remembered the way she had looked at him yesterday, a mixture of awe and something deeper that he had been too arrogant to acknowledge. He also remembered his own words in the Great Hall, the way he had tossed her dignity aside to appease the egos of his men. A sudden, sickening realization washed over him, a wave of guilt so potent it made his stomach churn. "She left," Cassian whispered, the words tasting like ash. "She heard me, Silas. She heard what I said about her not being queen material." His wolf let out a mournful howl in the back of his mind. In that moment, the fog of the Alpha's ego cleared, and the truth slammed into him with the force of a landslide. The pain in his chest wasn't a wound from a battle, it was the mate bond snapping awake. The goddess had played a cruel joke, or perhaps a lesson in humility, by tying his soul to the very woman he had just publicly humiliated. Amara wasn't just a capable girl with a needle, she was his fated mate, his other half, the woman designed to balance his fire with her light, and he had driven her away before he even knew she belonged to him. "Find her!" Cassian roared, his voice shaking the stone walls. "Assemble the trackers. I want every inch of this territory searched. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will burn this forest to the ground." "Cassian, she's an Omega in rogue territory," Silas cautioned, his face pale. "If she crossed the border, she's heading toward the Iron Crag Pack. Luka Voss is patrolling those borders, and you know he's looking for any excuse to start a blood feud." The mention of Luka Voss made Cassian's blood boil. Luka was a man who ruled through terror and shadow, a dark mirror of what Cassian feared he might become. The thought of Amara, his gentle, fragile mate, in the hands of a monster like Luka, sent a surge of primal rage through his veins. He didn't wait for his armor. He shifted right there in the bedroom, his bones cracking and reforming with a violent, agonizing speed that mirrored the turmoil in his heart. A massive, charcoal gray wolf stood where the king had been, his eyes glowing with a predatory amber light. He leapt from the balcony, his claws digging into the stone as he hit the ground running. He didn't need the trackers. He could smell her now. Her scent was a fading trail of lavender and grief, leading straight toward the forbidden northern border. He pushed his body to the limit, his muscles burning as he blurred through the underbrush. Every second she was alone was a second his soul felt like it was being ripped apart. He ran because his life depended on it. He ran because he had been a fool who valued status over the heartbeat of his own mate. The forest began to change as he approached the border. The trees were twisted and gnarled, the air thick with the smell of decay and old blood. This was no man's land, a place where the laws of the packs were replaced by the law of the fang. He slowed to a trot, his ears swiveling to catch any sound of a struggle. He found a scrap of her cloak caught on a bramble, the fabric stained with the dark earth. The sight of it made his wolf snarl, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in his chest. Suddenly the wind shifted, bringing with it a scent that made his hackles rise. It was the smell of old iron and sulfur, the scent of Luka Voss. And beneath it, nearly drowned out by the musk of the rogue pack, was the unmistakable terrified scent of Amara. She wasn't just near the border, she was already across it. Cassian stood at the edge of the Moonfall territory, the invisible barrier pushing back against his presence. To cross was to declare war. To stay was to lose the only thing that mattered. He didn't hesitate. He stepped across the line, the transgression echoing through the spiritual link of his pack. He was no longer just a king looking for a servant. He was a mate hunting for his soul. But as he looked toward the dark towers of the Iron Crag in the distance, he realized that finding her was only the beginning. He had to convince her that the man who had laughed at her was dead, and that the man who remained was willing to crawl through hell to earn her forgiveness. The path ahead was shrouded in mist, a metaphor for the uncertain future he had created for himself. Why does a man realize the value of water only when the well is dry? He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the rhythmic thud of his paws against the earth. He would find her. He would bring her home. And then, he would spend every day for the rest of his life making sure she never felt invisible again. Because an alpha without his omega is just a beast waiting for the end.
Chapter 3. The Rogue's Sanctuary. The cold of the rogue lands wasn't like the cold of the mountains. It was a biting, sentient thing that seemed to seep through Amara's skin and settle in her very bones. She stumbled over a protruding root, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as the adrenaline of her escape began to fade, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion. Every shadow looked like a crouching wolf, and every rustle of leaves sounded like the footsteps of the guards she was sure Cassian had sent to fetch her back. Why would he send them, though? To him, she was a minor inconvenience, a broken tool that needed replacing. She reached a clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a jagged cliffside honeycombed with caves. This was the heart of the Iron Crag, a place whispered about in nursery rhymes to keep children from wandering. She had expected monsters, but as she leaned against a mossy boulder to catch her breath, she saw something else entirely. A group of wolves were gathered around a communal fire, their coats scarred and their eyes weary. But they were sharing a meal with a camaraderie she had never seen in the rigid halls of Moonfall. There was no hierarchy here based on birthright, only a shared survival that seemed to forge a different kind of bond. "You're a long way from home, little moon wolf," a voice smooth as dark silk murmured from the shadows behind her. Amara spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for the small dagger in her pack. Standing a few feet away was a man with hair the color of midnight and eyes that held the chilling intelligence of a winter storm. He didn't radiate the overwhelming dominance of Cassian, but he possessed a quiet, lethal grace that was far more unnerving. This was Luka Voss, the alpha of the rogues, a man who had built a kingdom out of the outcasts and the forgotten. "I have no home," Amara replied, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain steady. "I am a rogue, just like you." Luca stepped into the light, a faint, intrigued smile playing on his lips. "A rogue with the scent of Moonfall's inner sanctum clinging to her? You smell of high-grade herbs and the Alpha King's personal chambers. Did you steal something? Or did you simply break his heart?" "He doesn't have a heart to break," she snapped, the bitterness in her voice surprising even herself. The rogue Alpha tilted his head, his gaze sweeping over her with a clinical intensity. "Interesting. You have fire in you, little healer. Most Omegas from the Great Packs are nothing but husks of obedience. Why did you leave?" Amara looked at the fire in the distance, the warmth of it beckoning to her. "I realized that being useful isn't the same as being valued. I'd rather be a wolf in the wild than a ghost in a palace." Luca chuckled, a low sound that didn't reach his cold eyes. "A sentiment I can appreciate. However, my hospitality isn't free. We are a pack of survivors, and everyone must contribute. We have wounded who need more than just prayer and luck. If you truly are a healer, prove it." He led her toward one of the caves, where a massive warrior lay on a bed of furs, his side torn open by what looked like a bear's claws. The wound was festering, the smell of rot filling the small space. Amara didn't hesitate. She dropped her bag and knelt beside the man, her training taking over. She didn't see a rogue or an enemy. She saw a soul in pain. She began cleaning the wound, her movements deft and sure, her mind focusing entirely on the task at hand. For the next several hours, she worked in a trance of purpose. She used her last remaining tinctures and found some wild roots near the cave entrance to create a drawing poultice. Luca watched her from the shadows, his presence a constant, silent weight. He didn't interfere, but she could feel his gaze tracing the lines of her face, evaluating her worth in a way that felt entirely different from Cassian's dismissal. Here, her skill was a currency, a reason to exist that didn't depend on her rank. "The fever is breaking," Amara said finally, wiping the sweat from her brow. He'll need fresh water and rest, but he'll live. Luca stepped forward, looking down at the sleeping warrior. You have a gift, Amara. A gift that extends beyond mere medicine. There is a light in your touch that calms the beast within. It's just science and a bit of luck, she demurred, standing up and stretching her aching back. Is it? Luca asked, stepping closer until he was within her personal space. Or is it the blood of the moon healers flowing through your veins? A lineage thought to be extinct. Yet here you are, tending to rogues in the dirt. Amara froze. The moon healers were legends, a bloodline of Omegas who possessed a spiritual connection to the goddess that allowed them to heal wounds of the soul as well as the body. She had always thought the stories were just fairy tales told to give Omegas hope. Was it possible that her talent was actually a dormant power? The thought was terrifying because it made her a target, a prize to be fought over by ambitious men. You stay here, Luca said, his voice dropping to a command. Under my protection. You will heal my people, and in return you will never have to hide in the shadows again. I will make you a queen of the rogues, Amara, a position far more powerful than any Luna in a gilded cage. Before she could respond, a sudden thunderous howl echoed through the valley, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that made the very ground beneath her feet tremble. It was a voice she knew in her marrow, a sound that carried the scent of cedar and lightning. Cassian was here. He had crossed the border, risking a war that could decimate both packs. Amara looked at Luca, who had already shifted his focus to the entrance of the cave, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of a fight. She realized then that she hadn't escaped the world of alphas. She had simply traded one cage for another. The conflict between the two men was a storm on the horizon, and she was the lightning rod that would draw the strike. Why does a bird fly from the cat only to find the hawk? She clutched her bag to her chest, her heart heavy with the realization that her journey toward freedom was only just beginning. The air in the cave grew thick with the coming conflict, the scent of the two alphas clashing even before they met. Amara stood her ground, no longer the invisible ghost of the infirmary, but the center of a brewing war. She would not be a pawn in their games. If they wanted her, they would have to realize that the mouse they overlooked had grown claws of her own. As the first shadows of the Moonfall warriors appeared on the cliffs above, she braced herself for the collision of two worlds, her soul a battlefield where love and anger fought for dominance. The story was no longer just about a girl who left home. It was about a woman who was discovering she was the most valuable piece on the board. And as the Alpha King's roar shook the mountain, she knew that the time for hiding was over. The moon was rising, and for the first time, Amara was ready to bask in its cold, unforgiving light.
Chapter 4. The Scent of Betrayal. The air in the Iron Crag territory tasted like iron and ancient stagnant moss, a sharp contrast to the crisp pine of my home. I moved through the underbrush as a shadow among shadows, my charcoal fur blending into the gloaming. Every breath I took was a desperate search for that singular, intoxicating note of lavender and wildflowers that belonged to Amara. Because I had been blind for so long, the goddess had seen fit to sharpen my senses into a jagged edge of longing. My wolf was a coiled spring of redirected aggression, snapping at the mental links of my warriors who followed me across the forbidden line. We were trespassers now, ghosts in a land that hungered for our blood. Yet I couldn't bring myself to care about the political fallout. Alpha, the scent is fresh here, but it's tangled, Silas whispered through the mind link, his voice crackling with the static of the distance we'd covered. I paused, my nose twitching as I caught the foul, sulfurous musk of Luca's patrol overlapping with Amara's fading trail. The realization that she had been touched by the aura of a rogue sent a pulse of possessive heat through my veins that nearly forced me to shift back into my human skin just to roar. How could I have been so remarkably stupid to let her believe she was replaceable? I remembered the curve of her neck as she bowed to me, a posture I once thought was duty but now recognized as a shield against my arrogance. Every step I took deeper into this rotting forest was a penance I was only beginning to pay. Suddenly, the wind shifted, bringing a sharp metallic tang that made my hackles stand on end. It wasn't just the scent of the rogue pack, it was the smell of a trap being sprung. I signaled my men to fan out, my claws digging into the soft loam as I prepared for the inevitable collision. Because I was the king, the weight of their lives rested on my shoulders, but my heart was already miles ahead, tucked into the pocket of a girl who didn't want to be found. We crested a ridge overlooking a shallow basin, and there, bathed in the sickly green light of the forest canopy, stood a scouting party of the Iron Crag. They weren't just patrolling, they were guarding something. My vision zoomed in on a scrap of pale fabric caught in the brambles near a cave entrance, the same color as the dress Amara had worn when she tended to my wounds. The sight of it acted like a match dropped into a vat of oil. I didn't wait for a tactical advantage. I launched myself from the ridge, a silent, gray blur of fur and fury. The skirmish was short and brutal, a chaotic dance of teeth and claws. I tore through the rogue lead with a savagery that shocked even my own beta, my mind playing a rhythmic loop of her name with every snap of bone. When the last of the scouts fled into the darkness, I stood over the remains of their campfire, my chest heaving. The silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself. I shifted back, my skin steaming in the cold air, and grabbed a discarded cloak to cover my nakedness. "She was here, Silas," I said, my voice a jagged rasp. But she wasn't a prisoner. She was helping them. I looked at a discarded bandage near the fire, neatly tied with a healer's knot, a knot only Amara used. The sting of her rejection was a physical wound, sharper than any claw. She had chosen the mercy of monsters over the protection of her king. As I stared into the dying embers of the rogue fire, I realized that the woman I was chasing was no longer the quiet girl I had left behind. She was becoming something else, something powerful and independent, and the thought terrified me more than any war.
Chapter 5. The Alpha's Shadow. The interior of the Iron Crag caves felt like the throat of a great beast, humid and smelling of earth. I sat by the pallet of the warrior I had saved, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. In the Moonfall Pack, my actions were always framed by my utility to the Alphas, but here, in the lawless dark, I was a miracle worker. Luka Voss stood at the entrance of the chamber, his silhouette framed by the moonlight, watching me with an intensity that made my skin itch. He didn't look at me with the dismissive pity of Cassian. He looked at me like a man who had found a weapon he didn't quite know how to handle. "You've been quiet for an hour, healer," Luca remarked, his voice a low vibration that echoed off the damp walls. "Most women in your position would be begging for a way home, or crying for their alpha." "I have no alpha," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, "and I stopped crying the moment I crossed the river." Luca stepped into the room, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. "A bold claim, but the scent of Cassian's mark is still faint on your soul. He's close, you know. He crossed the border an hour ago, tearing through my scouts like a rabid dog. He's not here for peace." The mention of Cassian made my heart stutter, a traitorous reaction I despised. Why did the mere thought of him still carry such weight? I remembered the way his eyes had lingered on me in the infirmary, a look I had mistaken for interest, but now knew was just the hungry gaze of a predator who had lost his favorite toy. He didn't want me. He wanted the order I represented, the comfort I provided without complaint. "Let him come," I said, standing up to face the rogue leader. "He can't force me to return to a place where I am invisible." Luca stepped closer, his scent of cold iron and smoke enveloping me. "He thinks you are a fragile thing, a flower to be plucked and placed in a vase. But I see the moon healer in you. I see the power that could unite the rogue packs and turn this world on its head. Why be a Luna when you could be a goddess?" His words were a seductive poison, offering a version of myself that was terrifyingly grand. Before I could answer, a roar split the night, a sound so primal and laden with grief that it made the cave dust shake from the ceiling. It was Cassian. He was at the mouth of the canyon, his presence a localized storm that demanded an audience. Luca's eyes lit up with a dark, predatory joy. He reached out, his fingers brushing my jawline with a chilling possessiveness. "He's here for his prize," Luca whispered. "Shall we show him that the prize has a mind of her own?" I followed Luca out into the main cavern, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rogue pack had assembled, a sea of scarred faces and bared teeth. At the far end of the canyon, standing alone against a backdrop of silver-tipped pines, was Cassian. He was in his human form, his broad shoulders squared, his face a mask of regal fury. When his eyes found mine, the air between us seemed to combust. The mate bond, which I had tried so hard to ignore, flared into a painful, incandescent heat. "Amara!" he called out, his voice carrying over the distance with the weight of an empire. "Come home. This isn't where you belong." "You don't get to decide where I belong, Cassian," I shouted back, the strength of my own voice surprising me. "You told the world I wasn't queen material. You laughed at the idea of me. Well, look at me now. I am the healer of the Iron Crag, and I am exactly where I need to be." I saw the flinch in his posture, a momentary crack in his alpha armor. It was the first time I had ever seen him truly hurt, and a dark, vengeful part of me relished the sight. But as Luca stepped up beside me, placing a heavy arm around my shoulders, the expression on Cassian's face shifted from grief to a terrifying, cold murderousness. The ground seemed to vibrate with the power of his wolf, and I realized that by trying to gain my freedom, I had sparked a fire that might consume us all.
Chapter 6. The weight of the crown. Standing in the mouth of that canyon, watching another man's hand rest on my mate's shoulder, was a torture I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. The air turned to ash in my throat because every instinct I possessed screamed for me to tear Luka Voss limb from limb. I could feel the eyes of my warriors on my back, waiting for the command to strike, but I was paralyzed by the look in Amara's eyes. It wasn't fear, it was defiance. She looked at me like I was a stranger, a ghost from a past life she had already buried. "Release her, Luca," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that made the nearby rogues shift uncomfortably. "This isn't a political move. This is between me and my mate." Luca let out a sharp, mocking laugh, his grip on Amara tightening just enough to be an insult. "Your mate? You have a strange way of showing affection, King. My sources tell me you treated her like a servant until the moment she vanished. A bond is just a suggestion to a woman who has finally found her worth." I took a step forward, the dry leaves crunching under my boots like bone. "I made a mistake, a devastating, arrogant mistake, but I will not leave here without her." "You'll leave here in a shroud if you take another step," Luca countered, his own warriors leveling their spears. "Because I was desperate, I did something no Alpha King of Moonfall had ever done." I looked past Luca, straight into Amara's defiant gaze, and I let the mask of the king fall away. I let her see the raw, bleeding hollow in my chest, where her absence had carved a hole. I let her see the shame that was eating me alive. "Amara, I didn't know. I was blind and foolish, wrapped up in the image of what I thought a leader should be. But the moment you left, the world went gray. I'm not here to command you. I'm here to ask for a chance to earn back the respect I threw away." For a heartbeat, the defiance in her eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of the girl who used to watch me from across the infirmary. But then, Luca leaned down and whispered something in her ear, a secret or a lie I couldn't tell, and her expression hardened once more. She stepped forward, out from under his arm, but she didn't move toward me. She stood in the center of the clearing, a small, fragile figure who suddenly felt like the most powerful person in the valley. "You speak of chances, Cassian," she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "But respect isn't a gift you give when you realize you're lonely. It's a foundation you build when no one is watching. You failed. And now I have people here who actually need me. Not for my status, but for my hands." "Amara, he's using you," I pleaded, my heart breaking in real time. "He knows about your bloodline. He doesn't want a mate. He wants a moon healer to bolster his army." "And what did you want?" she shot back, the words hitting me with the force of a physical blow. You wanted an Omega who would stay quiet and heal your men while you laughed at her behind closed doors. How is that any different? I had no answer because she was right. My past self was my own worst enemy, a ghost that was currently strangling my future. As Luca stepped forward to reclaim her, signaling his men to drive us back, I realized that words were no longer enough. The political tension had reached its breaking point, and the scent of war was thick in the air. I looked at Silas, who gave me a grim nod. We were outnumbered and in enemy territory, but I couldn't leave her here. "This isn't over, Luca," I declared, my voice echoing with the power of the Moonfall Pack. "You can hide behind your caves and your lies, but the bond cannot be broken by a rogue's whims." As we retreated into the tree line, the sound of the rogue pack's taunting laughter followed us like a pack of hounds. I didn't look back until we reached the safety of the ridge. I looked down at the canyon one last time, seeing Amara standing beside the fire, a queen in a kingdom of shadows. I had come to rescue her, but I realized now that the person who truly needed saving was me. The journey back to her heart was going to be a war, and I was just beginning to realize how much I was willing to lose to win it.
Chapter 7. The Healer's Throne. The morning mist in the iron crag did not lift. It merely thickened, turning the valley into a bowl of silver milk that tasted of damp earth and wood smoke. I stood at the mouth of the central cavern, my fingers stained purple from the berries I had been grinding into a sedative. For the first time in my existence, I was not looking over my shoulder to see if an alpha approved of my posture. The rogues did not bow, but they moved aside when I walked, their eyes reflecting a primal sort of reverence that felt heavier than the dismissive pity of my birth pack. Here, I was not the little healer or the capable Omega. I was the woman who had pulled their lead scout back from the brink of the abyss. "You're working yourself to the bone again, Amara," Luca remarked, his voice drifting from the shadows like a cool breeze. He stepped into the light, looking less like a monster and more like a man burdened by the weight of 1,000 secrets. He had spent the morning training his warriors, and the scent of sweat and whetstones clung to his leather vest. Because he treated me as an equal, or at least a very valuable asset, I found myself lowering my guard in ways I never had with Cassian. "The wounded don't wait for the sun to be high, Luca," I replied, not looking up from my mortar and pestle. "And your people have been neglected for far too long. Half these scars shouldn't have been permanent." Luca leaned against the stone wall, watching my hands with a predatory focus. "The world has a habit of throwing away what it doesn't understand. My pack is made of the broken, but you make them feel whole. Do you realize how dangerous that makes you?" I paused, the stone pestle clicking against the marble. Dangerous? I'm a healer, not a soldier. In a world built on strength, the one who decides who lives is the most powerful person in the room, he countered, stepping closer until I could see the flecks of gray in his storm-dark eyes. The Moon Healer bloodline isn't just about closing wounds, Amara. It's about the spirit. You aren't just mending skin, you're mending the pack's will to fight. Cassian knows this. That's why he's currently fortifying his borders instead of sleeping. The mention of Cassian felt like a cold needle pricking my heart. I hated that his name still had the power to disrupt my rhythm. I hated even more that I could still feel the phantom pull of the mate bond, a dull ache in my chest that throbbed in time with his distant heartbeat. He was close. I could feel his restlessness as if it were my own, but I pushed the sensation down, burying it under the practical needs of the rogue pack. He's fortifying his borders because he's afraid of losing his reputation, not me, I muttered, resuming my grinding. "You're wrong," Luca said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "He's afraid because he finally realized that the crown is worthless without the soul that keeps it grounded. But he had his chance. Here, you have a purpose that isn't defined by a marriage bed." He reached out, his hand hovering near mine, an invitation rather than a command. "The Moonfall Pack sees you as a servant. The Iron Crag sees you as a savior. Choose the side that lets you keep your fire." As the day progressed, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The rogues were no longer just survivors. They were becoming a unified force. I watched them sharpen their spears and practice their shifts, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of a new, shared hope. And at the center of it all was me. I was the catalyst. It was a terrifying, intoxicating realization. Why does a bird stay in the cage when the door is open? Because the world outside is vast and hungry. But here, I was the one doing the feeding.
Chapter 8. The Ghost of the King. The war room in the Moonfall Palace was a tomb of silent tension, the air thick with the smell of stale wax and the frantic energy of my advisors. I stood at the head of the table, staring at the maps, but all I could see was the defiant tilt of Amara's chin in the canyon. Every report Silas brought me was a fresh lash to my pride. The Iron Crag was growing stronger, the rogues were rallying, and the woman who should have been sitting on the throne beside me was the one providing their strength. "Alpha, we need to strike now before the northern packs join Luca's cause," one of my generals urged, his fist slamming onto the table. "He's using the Omega to claim he has the goddess's favor. It's a political nightmare." "She is not the Omega," I snarled, my voice vibrating with a power that made the maps flutter. "She is your Luna, and we will not strike while she is in the line of fire." "With all respect, sire," Silas interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "She told you herself she doesn't want to come back. She's leading their healers. She's flourishing there." The word flourishing felt like a jagged piece of glass in my throat. Because I had suppressed her for so long, she had blossomed in the shadows of my enemy. I walked to the window, looking out over the territory I had spent my life protecting. It felt hollow now. The victory drums I used to love sounded like the rattling of dry bones. I was a king of a ghost town because the heart of the pack had walked out the gates. "I need to see her," I whispered, more to myself than to the room. "You can't go back there, Cassian," Silas warned. "Luca will kill you on sight, or worse, use you to start a war we aren't ready for." "I don't care about the war," I snapped, turning back to face them. "I care about the fact that I can't breathe without her. The bond is screaming, Silas. It's not just a pull anymore, it's a physical weight. If I don't see her, I'm going to lose my mind." I left the room before they could argue, my footsteps echoing through the hollow hallways. I found myself in the infirmary, the place where she had spent her days. It was empty now, the shelves disorganized and the air missing that scent of lavender and hope. I sat on the edge of a cot, the same one I had occupied when she first stitched my shoulder. I closed my eyes, trying to summon the memory of her touch. It had been so gentle, so selfless. Why did it take her absence for me to realize that her gentleness was a strength I could never replicate? I decided then that I wouldn't go as a king. I wouldn't go with an army. That night I slipped out of the palace, shifting into my wolf form before I even reached the forest. I ran with a singular focus, my paws silent on the pine needles. I didn't care about the political stakes or the threat of Luca's spears. I just needed to look at her, even from a distance. Because a man can survive a wound, but he cannot survive the loss of his own soul. As I approached the Iron Crag border, the scent of her became a physical force, pulling me toward the cliffside. I found a vantage point high above the rogue camp, hidden by the thick branches of an ancient cedar. Below, the camp was alive with the glow of a dozen fires, and there she was. She was standing near a group of wounded rogues, her hands glowing with a soft, iridescent light as she moved from person to person. She looked powerful. She looked radiant. She looked like the queen I had told her she could never be. But as I watched, Luka Voss approached her, his hand moving to the small of her back in a gesture of casual intimacy. My wolf let out a silent, pained snarl. The sight of them together was a poison, a slow-acting venom that made me want to tear the world apart. She looked up then, her gaze sweeping toward the ridge where I was hidden. For a heartbeat, our eyes locked across the distance. She couldn't see me in the dark, but I knew she felt me. The bond flared, a white-hot line of connection that made my entire body tremble. She didn't look away. She stood taller, her hand moving to rest on Luca's arm as if to send me a message. I am chosen here, her posture said. I am seen. I stayed there until the fires burned low and she disappeared into the caves with the rogue Alpha. I stayed there until my fur was frosted with dew and my heart felt like a stone in my chest. I had come to find a way to bring her back, but as I turned to head home, I realized the truth. You cannot bring back someone who has finally found where they belong. You can only hope to become someone they want to return to.
Chapter 9. The Price of Protection. The confrontation at the border had changed something in the Iron Crag. The atmosphere was no longer just about survival. It was about preparation. Luca had become more attentive, checking on my needs every hour, ensuring I had the rarest herbs and the freshest water. But with the attention came a subtle tightening of the leash. I was no longer allowed to wander the forest alone. 2 large warriors were stationed outside my cave at all times for my safety. You look troubled, Amara, Luca said, joining me at the communal table for the evening meal. I'm a healer, Luca, not a prisoner, I said, setting my spoon down with a sharp click. I don't need guards to go to the spring. Luca leaned in, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. Cassian was on the ridge last night. My scouts saw his tracks. He's stalking you like a wolf in the tall grass. Do you really think he's here for your conversation? He wants to drag you back to that infirmary and lock the door. The news that Cassian had been there sent a jolt through me. A mixture of fear and a shameful, fluttering excitement. He had come back. Despite the humiliation, despite the risk of war, he had come just to look at me. But then I looked at Luca, who was watching me with an expectant, almost hopeful expression. He wanted me to be afraid. He wanted me to cling to him for protection. He won't touch me, I said firmly, though my heart was doing a frantic dance. I've made my choice. Have you? Luca asked, his hand covering mine on the table. Because the bond doesn't care about choices, Amara. It's a physical tether. As long as he's alive, he'll be a shadow over your life. But if you were to join with another, if you were to choose a new Alpha, the old bond would wither. I pulled my hand away as if his skin had burned me. You're talking about a rebonding. That's ancient magic, Luca. It's dangerous. It could kill the Omega. Only if the Omega's heart isn't in it, he countered, his eyes dark with ambition. Think about it. You'd be the Luna of the Iron Crag. Together, we could build a pack that doesn't care about rank. We could be the ones to finally put the Moonfall Pack in their place. I looked around the room, seeing the faces of the people I had healed. They were looking at me with hope, with trust. They saw me as their savior. But was I a savior? Or was I just a different kind of tool for a different kind of Alpha? Luca wasn't laughing at me, but he was certainly calculating my value. The weight of the Moon Healer bloodline felt like a lead shroud around my shoulders. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the camp entrance. One of the scouts stumbled in, his arm hanging at a limp, his face pale with shock. "They're here," he gasped, collapsing by the fire. "The Moonfall patrols. They've crossed the river in force." Luca stood up, his face hardening into a mask of cold, tactical joy. "So the king has finally lost his patience. Good. Let him come. We've been waiting for a reason to bleed him." He turned to me, his grip on my shoulder firm. "Stay in the caves, Amara. This is the moment where we prove who truly deserves you." As the rogues grabbed their weapons and the canyon filled with the sound of shifting wolves, I felt a wave of cold dread. The war I had feared was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. And I was the prize at the center of the carnage. I ran to the back of the cave, my mind racing. Why does love always have to look like a battlefield? Why can't a woman just be herself without being a trophy? I looked at the small dagger in my pack, the one I used for cutting roots. I wasn't going to hide. I wasn't going to be the reason these people died. I had to find a way to stop the collision before the forest was stained red with the blood of both packs. But as the first sounds of clashing steel echoed through the valley, I realized that some fires can't be put out once they've been lit. They have to burn until there's nothing left but ash. I stepped out of the cave, ignored by the warriors rushing to the front lines. I didn't head for the back exits. I headed for the mouth of the canyon, toward the scent of cedar and lightning. I had to face the man who had broken my heart, and the man who wanted to own my soul. Because if I didn't choose my own path now, I would be a ghost forever, no matter whose throne I sat beside. Chapter 10. The Iron Throat. The canyon floor vibrated with a rhythmic, bone-deep thrum that I initially mistook for my own frantic heartbeat, but it was the sound of 100 wolves descending the scree slopes. I stood at the threshold of the Iron Crag's main artery, my fingers white-knuckled around the hilt of my root-cutting dagger. Shadows danced violently against the jagged limestone walls as the rogue pack ignited pitch torches, their orange tongues of fire licking the humid air. Because I had spent my life as a quiet observer, I saw the nuance of the terror unfolding, the way the younger Omegas huddled in the crevices, and how the seasoned warriors bared their yellowed fangs in a grimace of suicidal loyalty. "Get back to the inner sanctum, Amara!" Luca roared, his voice cracking like a whip over the cacophony of clashing steel and snarling beasts. He didn't look at me as he spoke. His eyes were fixed on the bottleneck of the canyon where the first wave of Moonfall warriors had broken through. He shifted mid-stride, his bones snapping and elongating into the form of a massive soot-colored wolf with shoulders like granite boulders. Why did his protection feel so much like a territorial claim? I didn't move toward the safety of the caves because the scent of cedar and lightning was growing so thick it felt like I was drowning in a summer storm. Cassian was here, and he wasn't coming for a negotiation. A Moonfall scout lunged from a high ledge, a blur of silver fur aimed directly at Luca's throat. My breath hitched as the rogue Alpha caught the attacker mid-air, the sound of snapping ribs echoing off the stone like dry kindling. The violence was visceral, a chaotic tapestry of gray and black fur rolling in the dirt, punctuated by the metallic spray of fresh blood. I felt a sudden, sharp sting in my own side, a sympathetic phantom pain triggered by the mate bond as Cassian engaged someone nearby. He was hurting, and because our souls were stitched together by the goddess, I was bleeding with him. I shoved past a trembling sentry, my boots slipping on a patch of wet moss as I sprinted toward the mouth of the valley. I had to see him. I had to know if the man who had humiliated me was truly willing to die for the right to look me in the eye again. The air grew colder as I reached the clearing, and there he was, a charcoal-gray titan standing atop a pile of rubble, his coat matted with grime and the blood of his enemies. He wasn't the polished king I remembered. He was a primal force of nature, a creature of pure, unadulterated desperation. When his amber eyes locked onto mine through the haze of battle, the world seemed to fall into a vacuum of silence. The fighting continued around us, but for that heartbeat, we were the only two living things in the universe. He didn't howl. He let out a low, mourning sound that vibrated in my very marrow. It was an apology without words, a confession written in the tension of his massive paws. But before I could even draw a breath to call out, Luca slammed into his side, a collision of sheer muscle that sent both alphas tumbling into the dark river that bisected the canyon.
Chapter 11. The Moon Healer's Price. The freezing water of the Crag River shocked my system, but the fire in my blood was too hot to be extinguished by a mere mountain stream. I lunged at Luca, my jaws snapping inches from his jugular, my mind a fractured mosaic of rage and regret. Every time I felt his claws rake across my ribs, I thought of the way he had touched Amara's shoulder. Because he had dared to claim what was mine by divine right, I wanted to strip the skin from his bones. But as we wrestled in the shallows, the water turning a murky crimson, I caught sight of her standing on the bank, her face pale and her eyes wide, with a horror that pierced my heart deeper than any fang. "She's mine, Cassian," Luca snarled through our mental link, his voice a jagged edge of malice. She's the key to the northern territories. She's the moon healer that will make me a god. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. He didn't love her. He didn't even see her as a woman. To him, she was a battery, a source of mystical power to be tapped and drained. My rage shifted from possessiveness to a protective fury that leveled my focus. I kicked him away, shifting back to my human form as I scrambled onto the slick river stones. I stood gasping for air, my chest heaving, my skin mapped with shallow cuts that burned with the sting of the iron-rich water. "She is not a key, you bastard," I shouted, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "She is a person. She is a soul you aren't worthy of breathing the same air as." Luca shifted back as well, standing naked and unashamed on the opposite bank, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He signaled to his hidden archers, and suddenly, a dozen silver-tipped arrows were leveled at my chest. "You're a long way from your golden throne, King. Here, you're just a trespasser about to be buried in an unmarked grave." I looked past him to Amara. She was moving toward us, her hands raised in a gesture of peace that looked tragically fragile amidst the weaponry. Why did she always try to carry the weight of the world? I wanted to scream at her to run, to hide, to leave me to my fate, but my throat was constricted by a sudden, overwhelming surge of love. I saw the way the light caught the tears on her cheeks, and I realized that I would happily take every one of those arrows if it meant she never had to cry again. "Stop it," Amara's voice rang out, surprisingly steady. "Luca, lower the bows. Cassian, call off your men." "He's here to take you back to your cage, Amara," Luca spat, his eyes never leaving mine. "Don't be a fool." "No one is taking me anywhere," she countered, stepping between us, her small frame a shield against the looming war. "I am a moon healer, as you so loudly pointed out, and if either of you spills another drop of blood tonight, I will walk into the deep forest, and you will never see my light again. Is that what you want? A queen of ashes?" The silence that followed was absolute. The warriors on the ridges lowered their weapons, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Because she had finally claimed her own power, the alphas were forced to yield. I felt a strange, humbling pride swell in my chest. She wasn't the mouse hiding in the infirmary anymore, she was the storm.
Chapter 12. The Midpoint Shift. The tension in the canyon was a physical weight, a coiled spring waiting for the slightest nudge to snap. I stood between the two most powerful men I had ever known, feeling the heat of their competing auras pressing against my skin. Cassian looked shattered, his regal composure replaced by a raw, bleeding vulnerability that made my heart ache in spite of the anger I still harbored. Luca, on the other hand, looked like a predator who had just realized his prey had developed venom. "Luca, your men are wounded," I said, my voice cold and professional. "If you want them to survive the night, you will let the Moonfall healers assist me. Cassian, you will order your troops to the ridge. You will not enter this camp as a conqueror." "Amara, I can't leave you here with him," Cassian pleaded, his voice cracking. "He told me, he wants to use your bloodline. He wants to drain you." I turned to Luca, my eyes narrowing. Is that true? Was the protection just a way to keep the prize in the vault? Luca's silence was more damning than any confession. He shifted his gaze away, his jaw tightening. "The pack needs strength, Amara. You are that strength." "I am a person, not a resource," I snapped, the words feeling like a liberation. I looked back at Cassian. For the first time, I saw him not as a king, but as a man who was truly seeing me. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, soul-deep recognition, but the memory of his laughter in the Great Hall still burned like a brand. Why should I trust him now? Because he bled for me? Alphas bleed for many things: pride, territory, power. How did I know he was bleeding for me? "I will stay here for tonight," I announced, my decision ringing through the clearing. "I will tend to the wounded of both packs. Tomorrow we will speak. But if a single claw is bared before sunrise, I am gone. Do you both understand?" Luca gave a curt, resentful nod and disappeared into the shadows of the cave. Cassian lingered, his amber eyes searching mine for a sign of forgiveness he hadn't yet earned. He looked like he wanted to reach out, to touch my hand, to bridge the chasm I had spent weeks widening. But he didn't. He gave a respectful dip of his head, a gesture of submission that felt more significant than any declaration of love. "As you wish, Luna," he whispered, the title sounding like a prayer rather than a rank. As he retreated toward the ridge, I felt the mate bond hum with a low, steady frequency. It wasn't the frantic screaming of it was a quiet, persistent reminder of what we were. I turned back toward the infirmary caves, my mind already cataloging the supplies I would need. The war had been paused, but the battle for my soul was just beginning. I had reached the midpoint of my journey, and for the first time I wasn't running away. I was standing my ground. I walked into the cave, the smell of iron and herbs rising to meet me. I had a long night ahead of me, mending the bodies of men who had been trying to kill each other an hour ago. But as I set my mortar and pestle on the stone table, I realized that I wasn't just healing them. I was healing the girl who thought she wasn't queen material, because a queen isn't defined by the man who sits beside her, she's defined by the peace she can forge in the heart of a storm. Chapter 13. The Echo of Respect. The scent of iron and ozone lingered in the infirmary cave, a heavy reminder of the blood spilled during the skirmish. I moved between the rows of firs, my hands glowing with a soft, ethereal luminescence that made the shadows on the walls retreat. Every time my skin made contact with a wounded warrior, I felt a jolt of their pain, a sharp spike of agony that I absorbed and neutralized with the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. Because I was a moon healer, my body was a conduit for the goddess's mercy, but tonight, the mercy felt like a leaden weight. "You're pushing yourself too hard, Amara," a voice rumbled from the entrance, sounding like a distant roll of thunder. I didn't need to turn to know it was Cassian. His presence was a physical heat that settled between my shoulder blades, making the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He had followed my instructions, staying at the periphery of the cave, his massive frame partially obscured by the flickering torchlight. Why did his concern feel so much like a blade to my ribs? I ignored him, focused on pouring a tincture of yarrow and golden seal into a ceramic bowl. "The wounded don't stop bleeding just because I'm tired, Cassian," I replied, my voice sounding hollow and metallic to my own ears. He stepped into the light, and for the first time, I saw the extent of his own injuries. His chest was a roadmap of shallow rifts. The skin bruised a deep, angry purple where Luca's claws had found purchase. He looked like a king who had been dragged through the dirt, yet he stood with a quiet dignity that was far more unnerving than his usual arrogance. He didn't demand my attention. He simply waited for it, a submissive posture that made my hands tremble as I reached for a fresh bandage. "Let me help you," he whispered, his eyes searching mine with a desperate, soul-deep intensity. "You've helped enough for one night," I snapped, the bitterness rising in my throat like bile. "You brought a war to my doorstep. You turned this sanctuary into a slaughterhouse because your pride couldn't handle the fact that I left." I walked toward him, my boots clicking sharply on the stone floor. I grabbed his wrist, pulling him toward a stool with a force that surprised both of us. Because I was a healer, I couldn't leave him bleeding, even if I wanted to. I began dabbing at the wounds on his chest, the proximity making the mate bond flare into a white-hot, agonizing hum. The air between us was thick with the things we hadn't said, a pressurized silence that felt like it was on the verge of exploding. "It wasn't just pride, Amara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency that vibrated in my chest. "The moment you left, the light in the palace went out. I didn't realize until you were gone that you were the one holding the pack together. Not with strength, but with this." He gestured to my glowing hands. I was a fool. A blind, arrogant fool who didn't deserve the gift the goddess gave him. I stopped cleaning his wound, my fingers lingering on the heated skin of his shoulder. "You didn't need a bond to treat me with respect, Cassian. You didn't need a prophecy or a faded mate mark to see that I was a person with feelings. You only cared when you realized I was yours. That isn't love. That's ownership. The words hit him like a physical blow, his shoulders sagging as he let out a jagged breath. For a heartbeat, the Alpha King was gone, replaced by a man who looked utterly lost in the wreckage of his own making. He reached out, his hand hovering near my cheek, but he didn't touch me. He waited for my permission, a small gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 apologies.
Chapter 14. The King's Confession. Sitting on that stool, watching Amara's eyes flash with a righteous, searing anger, was the most humbling moment of my life. The pain in my chest from Luca's claws was nothing compared to the agony of hearing her speak the truth. Because I had spent my life surrounded by sycophants and soldiers, I had forgotten how to see the soul beneath the rank. I had viewed her as a functional part of my world, a quiet comfort I took for granted, like the sun rising or the change of the seasons. "You're right," I whispered, the admission tasting like ash in my mouth. "I didn't see you. I saw a role. I saw an Omega. I saw a girl who would always be there when I came back from the hunt. And for that I will spend every breath I have left trying to make it up to you." "I don't want you to make it up to me, Cassian," she said, her voice softening just enough to break my heart. "I want to know that if I were just a regular wolf, without this bloodline and without this bond, you would still think I was enough." I reached out then, unable to stop myself, and caught a stray lock of her hair, tucking it behind her ear. Her skin was like silk and fire, a combination that made my wolf howl with a primal protective need. "If you were a rogue, if you were a human, if you were a ghost, you would still be the only person who makes me feel like a man instead of a monster. I don't want the moon healer, Amara. I want the girl who stayed up all night to save a scout she didn't even know. I want you." The mate bond responded to my honesty with a surge of warmth that made my vision blur. For a fleeting second, the tension in her posture melted, and she leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering shut. I felt a spark of hope, a tiny, fragile flame in the darkness. But the moment was shattered by a sudden, violent crash from the main cavern. Luka Voss burst into the room, his eyes glowing with a manic, greenish light that smelled of forbidden magic and desperation. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by a group of warriors whose eyes were clouded with the same unnatural film. They didn't look like wolves anymore. They looked like husks, their movements jerky and puppet-like. "The conversation is over, King," Luca roared, his voice distorted by a magical echo. "The time for talking has passed. If you won't give her to me, I'll take what I need from her corpse." He lunged toward us, his claws elongated into obsidian blades that hummed with a dark energy. I shoved Amara behind me, shifting into my wolf form in a blur of fur and fury. The conflict had escalated from a pack dispute to something far more dangerous. Luca had tapped into the dark arts of the rogue ancestors, and he was no longer playing by the rules of the goddess.
Chapter 15. The Breaking Point. The air in the cave turned frigid, the torches flickering out one by one as Luca's dark aura expanded. I watched in horror as Cassian engaged the rogue leader, the two massive wolves colliding with a force that sent shards of limestone flying through the air. But this wasn't a normal fight. Every time Cassian landed a blow, the dark energy surrounding Luca absorbed the impact, glowing brighter with every strike. Luca was feeding on the violence, his power growing with every drop of blood spilled on the stone. "Cassian, stop!" I screamed, realizing the trap. "He's draining your strength through the bond. The more you fight him, the more he takes from both of us." But the Alpha's rage was too deep, his protective instinct overriding his reason. He lunged again, his jaws locking onto Luca's shoulder, only for a burst of black lightning to throw him across the room. Cassian hit the wall with a sickening thud, shifting back to his human form as he slumped to the ground, unconscious and bleeding from his eyes. Luca turned toward me, a twisted, triumphant smile on his face. He began to shift back, his body contorting in a way that made my stomach churn. He was always so predictable, Luca panted, his skin shimmering with the stolen energy. So easy to bait. And now, little healer, You are the only thing left between me and the world I intend to build." I backed away, my hand searching the stone table for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a heavy glass vial of concentrated moonseed, a potent poison if ingested, but a powerful catalyst for healing magic if handled correctly. I didn't have the strength to fight him physically, but I had a power he didn't understand. "You think you can take my light?" I whispered, my voice trembling but my resolve hardening into a diamond point. "My light isn't a resource, Luca. It's a choice, and I do not choose you." I smashed the vial on the ground between us, the liquid vaporizing instantly into a silver mist. I closed my eyes and reached deep into the center of my being, past the fear and the anger to the place where the goddess lived. I didn't try to heal Cassian. I tried to connect with him. I pushed my spirit through the mate bond, using it as a bridge to share the burden of the dark magic Luca was trying to channel. The pain was unimaginable. It felt like my veins were being filled with molten lead as the dark energy flowed through me. But I didn't pull back. I anchored myself to Cassian's heartbeat, using our connection to ground the power. The silver mist began to glow with a blinding intensity, illuminating the cave like a fallen star. Luca screamed, the stolen energy backfiring as it encountered the purity of the moonseed catalyst. The dark film on his eyes shattered, and he was thrown back against the far wall, his body convulsing as the forbidden magic was purged from his system. The cave fell into a ringing silence, the only sound the ragged breathing of 3 broken people. I collapsed to my knees, my vision fading to black. I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold, trembling, but familiar. "Amara?" Cassian whispered, his voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I looked at him, seeing the blood on his face and the terror in his eyes. We had survived the night, but the cost had been too high. Luca was down, but not defeated, and the war between our packs had reached a point of no return. I reached out, my fingers brushing his, before the darkness finally claimed me. "Don't leave me," he choked out, the words echoing in my mind as I drifted away. "Please, don't leave me again." Chapter 16. The Hollow Kingdom. The transition from the blinding silver light of the moonseed to the suffocating darkness of the Iron Crag's deepest dungeon felt like a physical drowning. My lungs burned with the stagnant, damp air of the lower pits, a place where the mountain's roots grew cold and the stone bled a black, oily moisture. I tried to lift my hands, but the heavy iron shackles around my wrists bit into my skin, their surfaces engraved with ancient, jagged runes that acted as a spiritual dampener. Because Luca had tasted the purity of my power and been rejected, he had replaced his pretense of protection with a brutal, calculating cruelty. He didn't want a queen. He wanted a battery in a cage. "You should have taken the deal, Amara." Luca's voice drifted from the darkness, sounding thin and wheezing. He stepped into the flickering light of a single tallow candle, his face a ruined map of scorched flesh where the light had purged his stolen energy. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by his own ambition, his eyes darting with a frantic, feverish intensity. Why did his madness feel so much like a reflection of the world I had tried to flee? He held a ceremonial obsidian knife, its edge shimmering with a dark, oily sheen that made my stomach churn with a primal dread. "The Moonfall Pack is broken," Luca whispered, leaning close until the smell of sulfur and rot was all I could breathe. "Your king is a shattered husk weeping in the dirt outside my gates. I've taken his strength, and now I will take the source. Tonight, the blood of the moon healer will feed the crag, and I will finally be beyond the reach of the goddess." I pulled at the chains, the iron searing my wrists as the runes flared with a sickly green light. "You can take my blood, Luca, but you cannot take my will. You are a king of nothing but shadows and pain." He didn't answer with words. He merely smiled, a terrifyingly empty expression that told me he had already left his humanity behind. He turned and left the cell, the heavy iron door clanging shut with a finality that echoed through my soul like a funeral bell. I slumped against the cold stone, the mate bond in my chest feeling like a frayed, vibrating wire. I could feel Cassian nearby, weak, grieving, and drowning in a sea of his own perceived failures. Because our souls were linked, I knew he wasn't just losing a battle. He was losing the reason to fight.
Chapter 17. The King of Ashes. The mud of the canyon floor was a cold, indifferent bed for a man who had once believed the world was his to command. I lay in the shadows of the outer fortifications, my charcoal fur matted with filth and my ribs clicking with every shallow, agonizing breath. My forces had been pushed back to the tree line, their spirits broken by the display of dark magic that had leveled our front lines. Silas was calling to me through the mind link, his voice a frantic buzz of strategic retreats and casualty counts, but I couldn't respond. Because I had failed the one person who mattered, the crown felt like a leaden weight, designed to sink me into the earth. "Get up, Cassian," a voice rumbled, though it didn't come from the mind link. I shifted my gaze to see Silas standing over me, his face a mask of grief and fury. He wasn't looking at me as a king, he was looking at me as a brother who was watching a man give up. He grabbed me by the scruff of my neck, hauling me into a sitting position with a strength born of desperation. "She's in there, you fool," Silas hissed, pointing toward the dark spires of the iron crag. "Luca is preparing the ritual. I can smell the dark herbs from here. If you don't move now, there won't be a moon healer to come home to. There won't be an Amara." The name acted like a jolt of lightning to my stagnant heart. I stood up, my legs trembling, my human skin mapped with the bruises of my defeat. I looked at the mountain, and for a heartbeat I felt the bond surge, not with power, but with a terrifying hollow despair. She was fading. Luca was draining her. Because I had been too slow, too arrogant, and too weak, she was paying the price for my sins. "I have no army left, Silas," I said, my voice a jagged rasp of its former self. "I have no power. The dark magic, it took everything." "It took your pride, Cassian," Silas countered, thrusting a discarded sword into my hand. "It didn't take your heart. Go to her, not as a king, not as an alpha. Go as the man who is willing to die just to hold her hand one last time." I didn't wait for a second encouragement. I moved toward the secret tunnels of the crag, a path I had learned from a rogue defector weeks ago. I wasn't running, I was stalking. I moved through the narrow stone corridors like a ghost, my senses narrowed down to a single vibrating frequency. The smell of cedar and lightning was gone, replaced by the scent of my own sweat and the iron of my blood. I reached the lower levels, the sound of rhythmic chanting beginning to vibrate through the floorboards. I found the door to the ritual chamber, guarded by two of the hollowed-out husks Luca called warriors. I didn't shift. I didn't have the strength. I used the sword, a clumsy, desperate arc of steel that found its mark more through the goddess's grace than my own skill. I pushed through the door, and the sight that met me made the world tilt on its axis. Amara was suspended in the center of a stone circle, her arms held wide by the iron chains, her head lolling to the side. Her skin, once radiant, was now the color of old parchment. Luca stood over her, his obsidian blade hovering over the vein in her neck, his eyes wide with a manic, unholy light. "Stop!" I screamed, the sound tearing my throat.
Chapter 18. The Lowest Point. The chanting was a physical pressure, a rhythmic pounding in my skull that threatened to extinguish the last flicker of my consciousness. I felt the heat of the candle flames licking at the soles of my feet, and the cold, oily weight of the runes on my wrists was pulling the very essence from my marrow. I was no longer a person. I was a reservoir being emptied. Why did the darkness feel so inviting? Because in the dark, there was no pain, no disappointment, and no memory of the man who had laughed while my heart broke. Then, through the haze of the ritual, I heard a voice. It wasn't the regal command of an Alpha King. It was a broken, desperate plea. I forced my eyes open, the light of the ritual chamber stinging my blurred vision. Cassian was there, standing in the doorway, looking like a ghost of the man I had loved. He was covered in filth, his chest heaving, his eyes welling with a grief so profound it momentarily quieted the chanting in my head. He wasn't attacking, he was falling. He slumped to his knees at the edge of the stone circle, his sword clattering to the ground. He didn't look at Luca. He didn't look at the dark magic. He looked only at me. "I'm sorry, Amara," he whispered, the words carrying over the hum of the ritual like a soft breeze. "I'm so sorry. For the laughter, for the silence, for thinking I was more important than the ground you walked on." Luca laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the air. "The king is kneeling. How fitting. Stay there, Cassian. Watch as I take the last thing you have left. Watch as I release her from the bond you used to choke her." "Do it," Cassian said, his voice steadying into a terrifying, hollow calm. "Release the bond, Luca. Take my life in exchange for hers. I am the one who failed the goddess. I am the one who doesn't deserve her. Let her be free of me, and I will walk into the dark without a single word of protest." The offer hit me like a physical shock, the mate bond in my chest suddenly surging with a final, desperate burst of energy. He was willing to sever our connection, the very thing that defined our existence, just to give me a chance to survive. He was willing to be a wolf without a soul if it meant I could breathe. Luca paused, the obsidian blade hovering inches from my skin. The ambition in his eyes flickered, replaced by a momentary confusion. He didn't understand the power of a sacrifice because he had only ever known the power of a theft. "You would give up the mate bond?" Luca asked, his voice trembling with a sudden uncertainty. "You would be a rogue? A ghost?" "I am already a ghost," Cassian replied, his eyes locked on mine. "If she doesn't love me, I have no home to go back to. Take the bond, Luca. Let her go, and I am yours." I looked at Cassian, and in that moment of absolute despair, I finally saw the man I had been searching for. Not the king on the throne, not the warrior on the battlefield, but the man who was willing to kneel in the dirt and give up his very soul for the woman he had once overlooked. The lowest point had been reached, and the world was silent, waiting for the blade to fall or the miracle to begin. "Cassian," I whispered, the word a fragile thread of hope in the darkness. Chapter 19. The Alchemy of Grief. The atmosphere within the ritual chamber thickened into a physical sludge, a suffocating mixture of sulfur and the metallic scent of Cassian's spilled blood. I watched through the haze of my fading vision as the man I had once thought was invincible remained pinned to the stone floor by his own remorse. Because he had offered up the very fiber of his being, the sacred mate bond, the dark energy of the ritual began to swirl with a confused, violent turbulence. Luca's obsidian blade trembled in his grip, the stolen magic he had channeled suddenly finding no purchase in a man who had already surrendered his soul. "You're lying!" Luca shrieked, his voice cracking under the pressure of the flickering runes. "An Alpha King would never choose a broken bond over his own throne. It's a trick of the Moonfall blood." "There is no trick in the truth, Luca," Cassian whispered, his gaze never wavering from mine, even as the greenish lightning of the circle began to arc into his skin. He didn't scream as the dark magic tested his resolve. He merely closed his eyes, his posture a testament to a strength I had never truly understood until this moment of absolute weakness. I felt the iron shackles around my wrists vibrate, the runes turning from a sickly green to a blinding, painful white. Why did the sensation of his sacrifice feel like a warm tide rushing back into a frozen sea? Because he was willing to lose me forever. The cage of the bond was no longer a weight. It was a weapon. I felt a sudden, sharp snap in the center of my chest, a spiritual detonation that shattered the iron dampeners on my wrists. The heavy chains clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like thunder in the small space. For a heartbeat, the ritual circle collapsed, the dark energy imploding into a single, dense point of shadow before expanding in a wave of pure silver light. I didn't fall. I stayed suspended by a power that wasn't stolen or channeled, but born from the intersection of his grief and my forgiveness. "Cassian, look at me," I cried out, my voice resonant with a power that made the stone walls groan. He looked up, And for the first time, the amber of his eyes wasn't clouded by arrogance or despair. It was clear, reflecting the radiant glow of a moon healer who had finally found her son. Luca let out a primal roar of frustration and lunged at me, but I didn't move. I didn't need to. The silver light surrounding me acted as a shield, a barrier made of every kind word and every moment of respect I had ever earned.
Chapter 20. The Rising Tide. The moment the chains shattered, I felt a surge of energy through the bond that I can only describe as a homecoming. It wasn't the heavy, possessive pull I had felt before, but a light, buoyant connection that seemed to stitch my broken ribs and mend my tattered spirit in a single breath. Because she had accepted my sacrifice, the goddess had seen fit to grant us a second chance, a final push against the darkness that had nearly consumed us both. I stood up, the sword in my hand no longer feeling like a clumsy weight, but an extension of my own renewed will. "It's over, Luca," I said, my voice carrying the weight of a king who had finally learned how to serve. "You cannot steal what is freely given, and you cannot break what has already been surrendered." Luca shifted into his monstrous, soot-covered wolf form, but the dark magic that had bolstered him was leaking out of his pores like black smoke. He was a creature of theft, and in the presence of a true sacrifice, he was becoming nothing more than a shadow. He lunged at me, a desperate, final attempt to reclaim the power that was slipping through his claws. I didn't meet him with a roar. I met him with the steady, quiet focus of a man who knew exactly what he was fighting for. The collision was a blur of motion, a chaotic dance of steel and fur in the heart of the ritual chamber. But I wasn't fighting alone. Every time I felt my strength falter, a pulse of silver light from Amara hit me, a wave of healing energy that acted like a second wind. We were a symphony of violence and grace, a synchronized unit that the rogue leader couldn't hope to match. Why had I ever thought I needed to lead her? She was the one guiding my hand, her spirit the North Star that kept me from drifting into the dark. "Now, Cassian!" Amara's voice rang out, a bell-like clarity in the middle of the storm. I saw the opening, a flaw in Luca's guard created by the blinding radiance she was emitting. I didn't aim for a killing blow. I aimed for the center of his power, the dark amulet he wore around his neck that acted as the anchor for his stolen magic. My blade found the obsidian stone, shattering it into 1,000 harmless fragments. The explosion of energy threw us both back, the chamber filling with a thick white mist that smelled of ozone and ancient mountain pines. Chapter 21. The Final Threshold. The mist began to clear, revealing a ritual chamber that had been purged of its darkness. Luca lay in a heap by the altar, his body returned to its human form, looking small and fragile in the aftermath of his ambition. He wasn't dead, but the dark magic had left him a shell, his connection to his own wolf severed by the very power he had tried to master. I looked past him to Cassian, who was leaning against a pillar, his chest heaving as he struggled to remain upright. "We have to go," I whispered, rushing to his side and wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "The rest of the rogue pack, they'll be coming." "Let them come," Cassian panted, a small, weary smile playing on his lips. "They followed a monster. They won't follow a ghost." We moved through the tunnels, the sound of the final battle outside fading into a heavy, expectant silence. As we reached the mouth of the canyon, I saw the Moonfall warriors gathered on the ridges, their eyes wide as they watched their king emerge from the darkness of the crag, supported by the Omega they had once laughed at. It was a sight that would be etched into the history of our pack for generations, the moment the hierarchy was leveled by a single act of love. "Amara," Cassian said, stopping just before we reached the center of the clearing. I turned to him, the morning sun finally beginning to peek over the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. He looked at me with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. But it wasn't the hungry gaze of a predator. It was the look of a man who was finally, truly seeing the woman standing in front of him. "You don't have to come back," he said, his voice a soft, vibrating rasp. The bond. It's different now. You're free. If you want to go back to the forest or find another pack, I will let you. I will protect your borders and never speak your name in a way that demands your return. Because you were right. You didn't need a bond to be respected. And you don't need me to be a queen. I looked at the horizon, at the vast, beautiful world that was now open to me. I could leave. I could be a rogue, a healer of the wild, a ghost in the trees. But then I looked at the man beside me, the man who had knelt in the dirt, who had offered his soul to the dark and who was now giving me the one thing I had always craved. A choice. I don't want to be a ghost, Cassian, I said, reaching up to cup his face in my hands. And I don't want to be a queen of a palace that doesn't know my name, but I think I'd like to see what a king looks like when he finally learns how to listen. I leaned in, my lips brushing his in a kiss that tasted of salt, silver, and the promise of a new beginning. The mate bond responded with a gentle, steady hum, a song of two souls finally finding their rhythm. The final push was over, and the path to redemption was open, paved with the wreckage of our old selves and the hope of what we were about to become.
Chapter 22. The Altar of the Humble. The morning air atop the Moonfall peaks was no longer a biting enemy, but a witness to a transformation that the pack laws never predicted. I stood in the center of the ritual plateau, the very place where alphas for generations had stood to demand the submission of their people. Because the world had shifted on its axis during the night of the crag, the stone beneath my feet felt less like a pedestal and more like a bridge. The entire Moonfall Pack had gathered, a sea of fur and faces that held a terrifying, expectant silence. They weren't looking at Cassian for a command. They were looking at the space between us, sensing the new, resonant frequency of a bond that had survived the fire. I have spent my life believing that a king is defined by the volume of his roar, Cassian said, his voice carrying across the valley without the need for a supernatural edge. He stood beside me, his royal mantle discarded, wearing only a simple tunic that showed the healing scars of the ritual. He looked at his people, his amber eyes reflecting a clarity that made the seasoned warriors lower their heads in a new kind of respect. Because he was no longer hiding behind the mask of the untouchable Alpha, he was finally able to reach them. He turned to me, and the air seemed to thicken with a sudden, beautiful heat. But a king is nothing without the soul of his pack, he continued, his voice dropping to an intimate vibration that I felt in my marrow. And I was a fool who almost let that soul walk into the dark because I was too proud to realize I was being carried by it. Amara is not your Luna because she is my mate. She is your Luna because she is the only one among us who knew how to lead when there was nothing left to gain. He did something then that made the entire pack gasp, a sound like a sudden intake of wind through the pines. He didn't demand I mark him. He didn't lean down to claim my scent. Instead, Alpha King Cassian, the man who believed dominance was the only currency of the wolf, sank slowly to one knee before me. He bowed his head, exposing the nape of his neck in a gesture of absolute, terrifying vulnerability. It was a public surrender of the old ways, a shattering of the hierarchy that had kept me a ghost for 20 years. "I choose you, Amara," he whispered, the words echoing off the mountain walls. "Not by the laws of the goddess, but by the choice of a man who is finally awake. If you will have me, I am yours to command."
Chapter 23. The Marking of the Sun. The stone was cold against my knee, but my heart was a forge of incandescent joy and terror. Because I had given her the power to reject me in front of everyone I had ever led, the silence of the plateau felt like an eternity. I waited, my breath hitched in my chest, realizing that this was the most important moment of my life. I wasn't waiting for a queen. I was waiting for the girl who had once looked at me with hope from the corners of an infirmary I was too blind to see. Then I felt it, the soft, warm touch of her fingers on my shoulder. Amara didn't tell me to stand. She leaned down, her scent of lavender and mountain rain enveloping me like a sanctuary. I felt her breath against my ear, a gentle tickle that made my wolf purr with a contentment I hadn't known was possible. Because she was a moon healer, her touch didn't just mark my skin. It marked my spirit, pulling the last remnants of my arrogance out of my chest and replacing it with a steady, enduring peace. "I mark you, Cassian," she whispered, her voice a melody that silenced the world. "Not as a king to be served, but as a partner to be loved. We will lead this pack together, or we will not lead it at all." She bit down, a sharp, stinging sweetness that sent a surge of golden light through the mate bond. It wasn't the violent snap of a forced connection, but the smooth, inevitable locking of two pieces of a puzzle. I stood up, my hand finding hers and interlacing our fingers, a physical anchor in the middle of the cheering crowd. The pack erupted into a howl of approval, a sound that shook the very foundation of the mountain, but I barely heard it. I was looking only at her. We walked back toward the palace, not as a master and a servant, but as two equals walking into a future we had carved out of the wreckage. The warriors moved aside, their eyes reflecting a wonder that told me the Moonfall Pack was already changing. They saw that strength didn't have to be cruel, and that the quietest among them could be the ones to save their souls. Because a man who has been humbled is a man who can truly see the world.
Chapter 24. The Queen's Voice. The throne room was no longer a cold hall of stone and shadows. Months had passed since the night at the crag, and the palace had begun to breathe with a different kind of life. The tapestries were pulled back to let in the sun, and the scent of drying herbs from the new, expanded infirmary drifted through the corridors. I sat in the chair beside Cassian, but I didn't sit in his shadow. I sat in the light we had created together. "The northern patrols are reporting that the rogue packs are beginning to seek alliance, Luna," Silas said, bowing with a genuine warmth that made my heart swell. "Tell them they are welcome, Silas," I replied, my voice steady and sure. "As long as they understand that in this territory every wolf has a voice regardless of their rank." I felt Cassian's hand cover mine on the armrest, his thumb tracing the line of my knuckles in a slow, rhythmic motion. Because he had learned how to listen, the pack had flourished in ways the elders never thought possible. We were no longer a pack of warriors waiting for a war. We were a community, building a legacy. I looked at the man beside me, seeing the way the sunlight caught the amber in his eyes, and I realized that the haunting question had finally been answered. Can a man who once humiliated the woman he loved become worthy of her heart? Yes. But not through power, and not through the bond alone. He becomes worthy when he realizes that her heart is the only throne that actually matters. Because I was no longer the girl hiding in the infirmary, I could see the truth clearly. I hadn't just saved his soul, I had found my own. As the sun began to set over the Moonfall peaks, painting the world in shades of fire and gold, I leaned my head against Cassian's shoulder. The mate bond hummed a quiet, contented song of two souls who had survived the storm to find the shore. The quiet Omega had become the queen who saved the king, and as the stars began to flicker in the velvet sky, I knew that our story was only just beginning. Because the best love stories don't end with a crown. They end with a conversation. Epilogue. The listener years. Later, a young Omega girl would sit in the infirmary, watching the High Luna lead a class on the healing arts. She would see the Alpha King enter the room, not with a roar, but with a quiet step, carrying a tray of tea for his wife. She would see the way he waited for her to finish speaking before he approached. And she would know, with the absolute certainty of the moon, that she was worthy of being chosen, because the king who once laughed now listens.